The hinge on the door of the Atlas Corporation CEO's office groaned a familiar tune. Inside, a tense atmosphere hung heavy, more oppressive than the brewing thunderstorm outside. Adam Sterling, the powerful CEO, stood ramrod straight, facing an African-American welder named Samuel. His hand clutched a rolled-up piece of paper, an old, yellowed technical drawing held together by a peeling strip of tape. His sharp eyes were fixed on Samuel, but this time not with the usual contempt, but with a look of profound confusion and shock. This moment of tension was the culmination of a series of events that began months earlier, as the new Atlas skyscraper project was in its initial stages. The steel skeleton of the new Atlas skyscraper clawed at the New York City sky, a metallic monument to ambition and capital. But on the 30th floor, amidst the deafening symphony of hammers, drills, and the rumble of cranes, Samuel was a figure of quiet contrast. He was a master welder, a man with hands like worn leather and a face etched with the wisdom of 1,000 completed joints. While other welders moved with a hurried, almost frantic energy, their sparks flying in erratic bursts, Samuel worked with a calm, almost meditative grace. His arc was a steady, brilliant blue, a focused beam of light that whispered rather than roared. He was the eye of the storm, a man whose movements were so deliberate, so precise, that he seemed to defy the chaos around him. The construction site was a world of its own, a raw, masculine environment where bravado and noise often eclipsed skill. Samuel, an African-American man in his late 50s, didn't fit the mold. He was an anomaly, a ghost moving through a world of muscle and steel. He paid no mind to the snide remarks, the casual slights that hung in the air like dust. Slow, they'd mutter, watching his meticulous pace. He's probably falling asleep up there, another would joke, a condescending smirk on his face. Samuel didn't react. He didn't have to. His work was his language, and it spoke volumes. His welding torch was a silent extension of his will, a tool of creation rather than just a piece of equipment. He didn't just fuse steel, he sculpted it. Each bead of molten metal was laid with the care of a calligrapher's ink, forming a seam that was not only structurally sound, but aesthetically perfect. While others left jagged, uneven welds that would later need grinding, Samuel's seams were clean, strong, and beautiful from the first pass. This wasn't just a job for him. It was an art form, a sacred trust passed down from his father and his grandfather before him. It was a legacy of building, of crafting foundations that would stand for generations. Samuel's quiet demeanor was often mistaken for weakness or incompetence. The younger guys, fresh out of trade school and full of youthful arrogance, saw his measured movements as a sign of age-induced slowness. They couldn't comprehend that his speed came not from frantic motion, but from absolute efficiency. He never wasted a movement. Every angle was calculated, every position optimized. His experience had taught him that haste leads to errors, and on a skyscraper, an error could cost lives. His respect for his craft was his armor, a silent shield that deflected the casual prejudice and subtle insults that buzzed around him. He simply put on his helmet, lowered his visor, and let the world fade away, replaced by the brilliant, focused light of his torch. But the site was a microcosm of a larger world, and prejudice, no matter how subtle, has a way of finding its mark. The project foreman, a gruff man named Mike, who was more concerned with deadlines than craftsmanship, often gave Samuel the most challenging, least desirable welds. The high-altitude joints, the awkward corners, the places where a lesser man would falter. Mike saw it as a way to push the old-timer, to expose what he believed was Samuel's dwindling capacity. What he didn't realize was that these were the exact challenges Samuel lived for. These were the opportunities to prove his worth, not to his colleagues or his boss, but to the steel itself. He saw each difficult weld as a puzzle to be solved, a testament to his years of practice and deep understanding of the material. One afternoon, a young welder named Jake, fresh out of the city's top welding school, scoffed openly as Samuel meticulously prepared a complex T-joint on a high beam. "Why don't you just get on with it, old man?" Jake sneered. "We've got a schedule to keep." Samuel glanced up, his dark eyes meeting Jake's. He didn't say a word. Instead, he simply adjusted his helmet and began to work. The arc flared to life, and for the next few minutes, the only sound was the low, steady hiss of the weld. Jake watched, his smug expression slowly fading as he witnessed the perfection of Samuel's work. The bead was a flawless, unbroken line of silver, a testament to a level of skill Jake had only read about in textbooks. He was humbled, but too proud to admit it. Despite these small moments of silent victory, the undercurrent of resentment and impatience continued to build. The project was falling behind schedule, and the pressure from the top was immense. Adam Sterling, the CEO of Atlas Corporation, was a man who saw the world in terms of numbers and deadlines. To him, the construction site was a machine, and any component that wasn't performing at maximum efficiency was a liability. He had no time for artistry or craftsmanship. He wanted results, and he wanted them now. He was coming to the site for an inspection, and everyone knew that meant trouble. The atmosphere grew thick with anxiety, a palpable sense of dread hanging over the project. This looming visit was the perfect storm. The pressure, the delays, and the unchecked arrogance from the top were all about to collide with the quiet dignity of one man. Samuel, the craftsman who moved with a pace misunderstood as slowness, was about to become the scapegoat. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the chasm between corporate power and true value. The first crack in this fragile equilibrium was about to appear, and it would be the catalyst for everything that followed. The air on the 30th floor of the Atlas skyscraper grew heavy, not with the dust of construction, but with the suffocating weight of Adam Sterling's fury. He had arrived on site like a thunderclap, a man accustomed to having his presence shake the ground beneath him. His Italian leather shoes looked out of place against the rough concrete, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the grime-covered workwear of the crew. Project delays had become a personal affront to him, a stain on his perfectly curated record of success. He had come here not to solve a problem, but to find a scapegoat, and his eyes, sharp and predatory, had zeroed in on Samuel. "You," Adam's voice boomed, cutting through the din of the construction site. The workers closest to him instinctively flinched, their hammers and drills falling silent. Adam pointed a stiff finger at Samuel, who was just preparing to weld a particularly tricky diagonal brace. "You're the slowest one here, aren't you?" The accusation hung in the air, a direct challenge. Samuel paused, his dark eyes meeting Adam's without a flicker of defiance or fear. He simply held the welding torch, its tip pointing to the ground, a silent, unmoving figure in a sea of sudden stillness. He didn't need to defend himself. His work was his defense. But Adam didn't see the craftsmanship. He only saw the clock. He saw a man who wasn't moving fast enough, a liability in his grand design. "Don't ignore me," Adam snarled, his voice rising in volume. He stormed over the uneven floor, the gravel crunching under his expensive shoes. He stopped directly in front of Samuel, invading his space, trying to intimidate him with sheer proximity and volume. "I asked you a question. Why are you so slow? Do you have any idea how much this project costs? Do you know what happens when we miss deadlines?" Samuel slowly removed his welding helmet, letting it hang by his side. The action was deliberate, unhurried, a gesture of respect that Adam mistook for indifference. "I am welding with precision, sir," Samuel said, his voice calm and deep. "It is the only way to ensure the structural integrity." Adam scoffed, a short, bitter laugh that was full of contempt. "Precision? This is a construction site, not a damn art gallery. We have schedules to keep, and you're costing me a fortune with your precision. What's your name?" "Samuel," he replied, his gaze unwavering. Adam's face tightened with anger, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Samuel, do you know that one mistake from a welder like you could bring this whole building down? And if you mess up, if you make me late one more day, you're fired. Do you understand?" Samuel simply nodded, his face impassive. He understood the risks better than Adam ever could. He had spent his life building structures that were meant to outlast him. The responsibility of that was something he carried every day. But Adam saw the nod as a simple, empty agreement, a sign of a man too dim-witted to grasp the gravity of the situation. "And do you even know who I am?" Adam demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The question was a power play, a classic assertion of dominance. He expected Samuel to look away, to show deference, to be humbled. "You are the chairman, Mr. Adam Sterling," Samuel said, his eyes holding steady. The lack of fear in his voice only infuriated Adam further. It was as if this man, this simple labourer, didn't recognise the power he held over him. He wasn't bending. He wasn't breaking. "If you don't want to work, then leave," Adam shouted, his face red with rage. He had tried every tactic in his playbook: intimidation, verbal assault, a direct threat. And yet, this man stood before him, calm and composed, a quiet anchor in the storm Adam was whipping up. Adam needed to break him, to make an example of him in front of the entire crew, to remind everyone who was in charge. The words "then leave" hung in the air, a final ultimatum. A nervous silence descended upon the construction site. All eyes were on Samuel, who stood motionless, his fate seemingly sealed. The crew held its breath, waiting for the inevitable moment when the old man would be dismissed, a casualty of corporate impatience. A few feet away, a young foreman, Mike, was already looking around nervously, wondering who he would have to replace. It was at that exact, tense moment that a sudden, violent gust of wind tore across the skeletal structure. The wind, a capricious force of nature, seemed to be answering Adam's storm with one of its own. It howled through the open framework, kicking up dust and debris. The men braced themselves, but the wind's true target was far more subtle. It whipped a small, folded piece of paper from the pocket of Samuel's worn-out work jacket. The paper, fragile and insignificant, fluttered on the air currents. It danced in the wind, a silent witness to the escalating conflict, before spiraling down and landing perfectly at Adam Sterling's feet. The entire crew watched, frozen in place. "Oh, he's definitely fired," a young welder whispered. "What a shame! Samuel's a great welder," another murmured. The consensus was clear. The paper was a final insult, a sign of carelessness that would seal Samuel's fate. Adam, his anger still simmering, bent down, intending to simply crumple the paper and toss it aside. It was just another piece of trash, another example of this man's sloppiness. But as he picked it up, his eyes, still filled with rage, glanced at the drawing. His actions, his thoughts, his entire world would come to a sudden, screeching halt. Adam's fingers, poised to crush the paper into a ball, froze. His sharp eyes, trained to scan financial reports for discrepancies and market trends, were now scanning a technical drawing. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges and held together by a strip of peeling tape. For Adam, it was a ghost from his past, a relic from a life and a friendship that he had long since relegated to the recesses of his memory. He didn't recognize the specific blueprint for the obscure steel framework, but he recognized the signature. The bold, elegant script was unmistakable. It was the signature of Elias Thorne, a world-renowned Pritzker Prize-winning architect. Elias had been a visionary, a man who saw buildings not as static structures, but as living works of art. He had also been one of Adam's closest friends and collaborators. Together they had built some of the most iconic towers in the world, with Adam's business acumen and Elias's boundless creativity forming an unstoppable partnership. But Elias had passed away 2 years prior, and with his death, a part of Adam had died too. Adam stared at the signature, the name a bittersweet memory. He could almost hear Elias's voice, full of passion and artistic fervour, describing some impossible structural design. But it was the smaller, neater handwriting beneath the signature that truly sent a jolt of ice through Adam's veins. In elegant script, the words read, "To Samuel, the best welder I ever had the honour of working with." A wave of profound shock washed over Adam. He looked up, his eyes a confused vortex of dawning realization, trying to reconcile the image of the quiet, aging labourer he had just humiliated with the man described in his friend's note. The name Samuel was a name that had haunted Adam for years. Elias had always spoken of a master craftsman, a welder with an almost mystical ability to turn his most audacious designs into reality. Elias had called him his silent partner, the man who was as much a part of the creative process as the architect himself. Elias had praised his skill, his unwavering commitment to his craft, and his almost inhuman precision. Adam had spent years after Elias's death trying to track down this Samuel, believing he was the key to unlocking some of Elias's unfinished projects. He had searched through old blueprints, construction records and archives, but the man had seemingly vanished. And now here he was, standing right in front of him. The old man he had just accused of being slow and costing him a fortune was the very legend he had been searching for. The man who had been the ghost in Adam's search was flesh and blood, a quiet, dignified figure on his own construction site. The world seemed to shrink to just Adam, Samuel, and the small, yellowed piece of paper. Adam's mind reeled, replaying the entire confrontation. His words, his accusations, his unbridled arrogance, they all came flooding back, each one a hammer blow to his ego. He had stood there, a man of immense power, and publicly shamed a master, a legend, a man revered by one of the greatest creative minds of their generation. The shame was a bitter taste in his mouth, a physical sensation that made his stomach churn. The construction crew, still watching in bewildered silence, began to stir. They saw the transformation on their CEO's face. The red-faced anger had been replaced by a mask of disbelief, and then slowly something else entirely, a profound, dawning awe. Adam's gaze shifted from the paper to Samuel, and back again. He was piecing together the puzzle, and the picture that was forming was a brutal reflection of his own hubris. A low murmur rippled through the crew. They had heard whispers of Samuel's skill, but they had always assumed it was just a labourer's legend, exaggerated stories passed down over beers. But now, seeing the CEO of Atlas Corporation, a man who rarely showed emotion, standing there utterly dumbfounded with a piece of paper in his hand, they started to put the pieces together. They saw the shift in Adam's posture, the way his shoulders had slumped, the respect that was now replacing the contempt in his eyes. Jake, the young welder who had mocked Samuel earlier, felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. He remembered Samuel's calm hands, the flawless weld, the quiet dignity. He had thought it was just a fluke, a lucky shot. Now, he realized he had been in the presence of greatness and had been too arrogant to see it. The silence on the construction site was now thick with a new collective realization. The scorn and prejudice that had been so casually tossed at Samuel now seemed to fall back on the men who had shown it, a karmic boomerang of shame. Samuel, the man they had dismissed as a slow, old-fashioned welder, was in fact the master craftsman praised by a legend. He was the most valuable person on this entire project, a human anchor of skill and integrity. The realization hit Adam with the force of a physical blow. The paper felt heavy in his hand, a tangible representation of his own folly. The scorn he had shown was a brutal indictment of his own superficiality. He had judged a book by its cover, and the cover was old and worn, but the contents were a masterpiece. The master he had been searching for had been right under his nose the entire time, a quiet, unassuming man who simply wanted to do his job with the integrity and precision of a true artisan. The arrogance had been his, not Samuel's. He looked up at Samuel one last time, his expression a mixture of awe and profound, deep-seated shame. The public humiliation he had intended for Samuel had turned into a far more devastating humiliation for himself. The master was not the one who had been brought low, it was the one who had tried to bring him down. Adam's head, full of pride and power just moments before, now felt heavy. The first sign of his surrender was about to be made. The silence on the 30th floor of the Atlas skyscraper stretched thick with a new, profound meaning. The deafening clamour of construction had ceased, replaced by a vacuum of sound that amplified the smallest rustle of a wind-whipped tarp. Adam Sterling stood frozen, the small yellowed piece of paper trembling in his hand. His eyes were locked with Samuel's, but his gaze was no longer one of contempt or anger. It was a gaze of a man who had just seen his entire world-view shatter. The man he had dismissed as a slow, clumsy labourer was in fact a legend, a master craftsman revered by one of the greatest architects of their time. The weight of this truth settled on Adam's shoulders like a physical burden. He had always seen himself as the ultimate authority, the man whose vision and capital built empires. He had believed that he was the most important person on any given project, and that everyone else was simply a tool to execute his will. But in this singular, breathtaking moment, he realized he had been utterly, catastrophically wrong. The real value, the true artistry, was not in the corner office. It was here, on a cold, concrete floor, in the hands of a man he had just publicly shamed. His pride, an edifice he had spent a lifetime building, crumbled to dust. He remembered his words, the scathing insults, the arrogant threats. They echoed in his mind, each one a hammer blow to his ego. Slow. Costing me a fortune. Leave if you don't want to work. He had been so blind, so consumed by his own impatience and prejudice, that he couldn't see the silent genius standing right in front of him. The man he had been searching for 2 years, the key to unlocking the legacy of his friend Elias, had been a target of his own ignorance. The construction crew, initially confused, began to understand. They saw the transformation on Adam's face. The red-faced rage had drained away, replaced by a look of profound shock, then dawning realization, and finally a deep, stinging shame. They watched as the formidable CEO of Atlas Corporation, a man who had never been known to back down, seemed to shrink before their eyes. The power dynamic, so brutally clear just moments ago, had completely flipped. A low murmur rippled through the men, a sound of understanding and awe. "I knew he was good, but a Pritzker winner's personal welder?" a foreman whispered, his voice barely audible. "We've been calling him Old Slow Hands for months," another said, the shame now reflected in his own voice. The casual slights and subtle insults that had been thrown at Samuel now felt like a collective act of profound disrespect. They had all been part of it, a silent complicity in a public shaming that had in fact been a brutal exposure of their own ignorance. Adam looked up from the drawing, his eyes meeting Samuel's again. He expected to see anger, resentment, or a smug satisfaction in the man's eyes. But there was none of that. Samuel's face was a mask of calm composure. He wasn't gloating, he wasn't vindicated, he was simply there. He was a quiet anchor in a storm of Adam's own making. It was this lack of reaction, this unshakable dignity that humbled Adam more than anything else. Samuel wasn't angry, he was just a craftsman, a man who believed in the integrity of his work of all else. His worth didn't need to be validated by the CEO's praise or Elias Thorne's note, it was simply a part of who he was. The paper in Adam's hand felt heavy, a tangible testament to his own folly. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence punctuated only by the distant hum of city traffic. The weight of his own arrogance was crushing him. The public humiliation he had intended for Samuel had turned into a far more devastating and personal humiliation for himself. The master was not the one who had been brought low, it was the one who had tried to bring him down. Slowly, deliberately, Adam lowered his head. It was a gesture of humility he had never shown to anyone in his professional life. His shoulders, which had been set in a posture of aggressive power, slumped. He took a deep, shaky breath, and the words, when they finally came, were a mere whisper in the vast open space of the construction site. "I'm sorry," he said, the two words feeling foreign on his tongue. He looked up, his eyes now filled with a raw, genuine contrition. "Samuel, I was wrong. I apologize for everything I said. For my ignorance, I had no idea." His voice trailed off, the weight of his apology too heavy to put into more words. He held out the drawing to Samuel, a silent offering of respect and acknowledgement. The paper, once a source of conflict, was now a bridge between two very different worlds. Samuel simply took the paper, his hands, calloused and strong, brushing lightly against Adam's. He folded it carefully and slipped it back into his pocket, the movement unhurried and precise. He didn't say, "It's okay," or "I accept your apology." He didn't need to. His silence was a form of grace, a quiet understanding that the apology was not for him, but for Adam's own soul. The silence on the construction site was absolute. The men watched, stunned and motionless, as their formidable CEO, a man whose word was law, lowered his head and offered a sincere apology to the quiet welder. The tension that had moments ago been a suffocating weight was replaced by a palpable collective awe. Adam Sterling, the master of the corporate universe, had been humbled, and the source of his humbling was standing calmly before him, a man he had just publicly and viciously insulted. Adam's words, "I'm sorry, Samuel," were a thunderous testament to a complete change of heart. His arrogance, the polished armor he wore in every boardroom and on every construction site, had been stripped away. He now looked at Samuel not as a subordinate, but as a master craftsman, and in that moment the entire crew began to see Samuel in the same light. The man who had been a quiet figure on the periphery was now the unquestionable center of gravity on the site. Adam's face, usually a mask of unyielding determination, was now etched with a deep, genuine humility. He felt a profound sense of shame, not just for his words, but for his entire world view. He had been so focused on the bottom line, on speed and efficiency, that he had become blind to the very essence of what they were building. The soul of a building wasn't in its financial projections, it was in the careful, precise work of a man like Samuel. The respect he had for Elias Thorne's legacy now extended to the man who helped bring that legacy to life. Samuel's response was a masterclass in quiet dignity. He didn't gloat. He didn't offer a dramatic speech about being vindicated. He simply took the drawing that Adam held out, his calloused hands brushing against the CEO's. He folded the fragile paper with care and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. His actions were deliberate, unhurried, and spoke louder than any words could. His lack of a verbal response wasn't a rejection of the apology. It was an act of grace. He understood that the apology was not just for him, but for Adam's own soul. He had seen this happen before, in different forms and different places. The quiet craftsman had always been a mirror, reflecting the true character of those around him. The crew, who had been holding their breath, now began to exhale. A new respect, a silent reverence, spread through the sight. The snide remarks, the casual insults, all seemed to vanish into the thin air. Everyone suddenly remembered a perfect weld Samuel had made, a tricky joint he had finished with impossible ease, a moment of silent mentorship they had once ignored. They saw him not as a simple labourer, but as a living bridge to the legacy of a great architect. He was a symbol of true craftsmanship in a world obsessed with speed. Adam, still reeling from the weight of his own misjudgment, knew he had to do more than just apologize. He had to show his change, to build a new foundation of trust. He had to prove that this wasn't just an act, but a genuine shift in his perspective. He looked around the site, his eyes searching for a new path forward, a way to bridge the chasm his own words had created. His gaze landed on a section of the steel framework where a particularly complex set of beams intersected. The other welders had been struggling with it all morning, the tricky angles and tight space making it a nightmare to weld with the required precision. They had tried to force the steel into place, leaving behind sloppy, uneven beads that would have to be ground down and redone. It was a problem that had been a source of the very delays that had brought Adam to the site in the first place. This was the perfect opportunity. This wasn't about public relations. It was about acknowledging true skill. Adam walked over to the section, the crew's eyes following him. He gestured to the tangled mess of steel, then looked at Samuel. We've been having trouble with this, Adam said, his voice still subdued. The tolerances are too tight. We need someone who can handle it. He didn't ask. He offered. He was presenting Samuel with a challenge, a test of his legendary skill, and a chance to prove his worth on his own terms. It was the first step in a new collaborative dynamic, a new kind of partnership. Samuel looked at the joint, his eyes studying the problem with the calm focus of a master. He saw not a tangled mess, but a puzzle. He saw the angles, the stress points, the flow of the metal. He saw the way the structure was meant to be, not the way it was currently being forced. He nodded slowly, a small, quiet gesture of acceptance. He didn't need to be told to get to work. He had a job to do, and he was the only one on this site who could do it right. He walked over to the spot, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The other welders, humbled and curious, gave him a wide berth. They watched as Samuel, with his calm hands and focused eyes, prepared his equipment. They knew, with a certainty that had been born in the last few minutes, that they were about to witness a master at work. The construction site was silent, all eyes fixed on Samuel as he prepared to tackle the complex weld that had stumped the rest of the crew. Adam, now standing respectfully at a distance, watched with a newfound awe. He saw Samuel not as a problem to be solved, but as a solution, a human anchor of skill and integrity. This was not just about fixing a welding problem, it was about rebuilding trust and a new understanding of value. Adam knew that this was just the beginning of a long journey, and that his most valuable lesson was being taught not in a boardroom, but on the 30th floor of a skyscraper by a man he had almost fired. A small crowd of welders, foremen, and labourers had gathered, drawn by the sudden shift in the site's energy. Their initial confusion had given way to a palpable curiosity. They watched as Samuel, with his calm hands and focused eyes, prepared his equipment. There was no rush in his movements, no sense of urgency. He was methodical, his actions a stark contrast to the frantic, frustrated attempts that had preceded him. He carefully inspected the joint, running his gloved fingers over the rough edges of the steel. He didn't just see the steel, he felt it. He felt the tension, the slight misalignments, the stress points where the previous welders had tried to force the metal into submission. He then took a moment to study the original blueprint that Adam had returned to him, his eyes tracing the elegant lines of Elias Thorne's design. He wasn't just fixing a joint, he was continuing a conversation between a master architect and a master craftsman. He didn't grab the nearest welding torch. Instead, he walked over to his own toolbox, which had been pushed to the side, and carefully selected a specific electrode. He adjusted the current on his machine, not to the maximum setting as the others had, but to a lower, more controlled heat. The other welders exchanged glances, their confusion evident. They had all been taught to burn it hot and fast on a job this big. Samuel, however, was an old-school craftsman. He knew that heat was not a brute-force tool but a delicate instrument. Too much heat and the metal would warp, the weld would be brittle. Too little and it would fail to penetrate. Samuel donned his helmet, the faceplate snapping down with a soft click. In that instant, the world outside faded away. There was only the steel, the torch, and the task at hand. The arc flared to life, a brilliant, focused point of white-blue light. It was not the angry, spitting flash of an inexperienced welder. It was a steady, humming glow, a point of pure energy. What followed was a silent masterclass. Samuel didn't just lay a bead of molten metal, he danced with it. His hand moved with a fluid grace, guiding the torch with an almost imperceptible rhythm. He was not forcing the metal to fuse, he was coaxing it. He held the torch at a precise angle, maintaining a perfect distance from the joint. The molten metal flowed from the electrode in a steady, unbroken stream, filling the gap with a seamless, silvery band. There was no splatter, no jagged edges, no wasted motion. The weld was a work of art, a perfect, unbroken line that flowed over the steel like liquid silver. The other welders watched in stunned silence, their jaws slack. They had never seen anything like it. They had always seen welding as a noisy, aggressive act, a battle between man and metal. Samuel showed them it could be a partnership, a collaboration. He was not just joining two pieces of steel, he was creating a single, unified whole. Adam, standing off to the side, felt a lump form in his throat. He saw the craftsmanship, the artistry, but he also saw something more. He saw the integrity. Samuel was not just welding for the paycheck or the deadline. He was welding for the building. He was a man who believed in the foundation, in the absolute, uncompromising truth of a strong structure. He was the very embodiment of the integrity that Adam had, in his haste and arrogance, overlooked. The entire process took less time than the other welders' frustrated attempts, but it felt like a silent eternity. When Samuel finally lifted his helmet, the perfect, flawless weld glowed with a faint, residual heat. He didn't look for praise or a round of applause. He simply moved on to the next task, his quiet dignity a powerful statement in itself. The knot of welders and foremen dispersed, but their conversations were different now. They spoke of the master, of how he did it, of the lesson they had just been given. Adam walked over to the completed weld, running his finger along the smooth, clean seam. He could feel the difference. This wasn't just a weld, it was a promise. A promise of strength, of safety, of a building that would stand for centuries. The shame he had felt moments ago was now replaced by a deep sense of respect and a quiet, firm determination to make things right. He knew that his most valuable lesson had been taught not in a boardroom, but on the 30th floor of a skyscraper by a man he had almost fired. This moment was not just a turning point for the construction site, it was a turning point for Adam Sterling himself. The construction site had been transformed. The quiet dignity of one man had replaced the frantic energy of the crew. Adam, humbled and inspired, knew that he had to change not just his actions, but his entire approach to the project. He sought out Samuel, not as a boss, but as a student, to ask for his guidance on the rest of the project. The two men, a powerful CEO and a quiet craftsman, began to forge a new partnership, a collaboration based on respect and a shared commitment to building something truly great. The construction site was silent, all eyes fixed on Samuel as he prepared to tackle the complex weld that had stumped the rest of the crew. Adam, now standing respectfully at a distance, watched with a newfound awe. He saw Samuel not as a problem to be solved, but as a solution, a human anchor of skill and integrity. This was not just about fixing a welding problem. It was about rebuilding trust and a new understanding of value. Adam knew that this was just the beginning of a long journey, and that his most valuable lesson was being taught not in a boardroom, but on the 30th floor of a skyscraper by a man he had almost fired. A small crowd of welders, foremen, and labourers had gathered, drawn by the sudden shift in the site's energy. Their initial confusion had given way to a palpable curiosity. They watched as Samuel, with his calm hands and focused eyes, prepared his equipment. There was no rush in his movements, no sense of urgency. He was methodical, his actions a stark contrast to the frantic, frustrated attempts that had preceded him. He carefully inspected the joint, running his gloved fingers over the rough edges of the steel. He didn't just see the steel, he felt it. He felt the tension, the slight misalignments, the stress points where the previous welders had tried to force the metal into submission. He then took a moment to study the original blueprint that Adam had returned to him, his eyes tracing the elegant lines of Elias Thorne's design. He wasn't just fixing a joint. He was continuing a conversation between a master architect and a master craftsman. He didn't grab the nearest welding torch. Instead, he walked over to his own toolbox, which had been pushed to the side, and carefully selected a specific electrode. He adjusted the current on his machine not to the maximum setting as the others had, but to a lower, more controlled heat. The other welders exchanged glances, their confusion evident. They had all been taught to burn it hot and fast on a job this big. Samuel, however, was an old-school craftsman. He knew that heat was not a brute force tool, but a delicate instrument. Too much heat and the metal would warp, the weld would be brittle. Too little and it would fail to penetrate. Samuel donned his helmet, the faceplate snapping down with a soft click. In that instant, the world outside faded away. There was only the steel, the torch, and the task at hand. The arc flared to life, a brilliant focused point of white-blue light. It was not the angry, spitting flash of an inexperienced welder. It was a steady, humming glow, a point of pure energy. What followed was a silent masterclass. Samuel didn't just lay a bead of molten metal. He danced with it. His hand moved with a fluid grace, guiding the torch with an almost imperceptible rhythm. He was not forcing the metal to fuse. He was coaxing it. He held the torch at a precise angle, maintaining a perfect distance from the joint. The molten metal flowed from the electrode in a steady, unbroken stream, filling the gap with a seamless silvery band. There was no splatter, no jagged edges, no wasted motion. The weld was a work of art, a perfect, unbroken line that flowed over the steel like liquid silver. The other welders watched in stunned silence, their jaws slack. They had never seen anything like it. They had always seen welding as a noisy, aggressive act, a battle between man and metal. Samuel showed them it could be a partnership, a collaboration. He was not just joining two pieces of steel, he was creating a single, unified whole. Adam, standing off to the side, felt a lump form in his throat. He saw the craftsmanship, the artistry, but he also saw something more. He saw the integrity. Samuel was not just welding for the paycheck or the deadline. He was welding for the building. He was a man who believed in the foundation, in the absolute, uncompromising truth of a strong structure. He was the very embodiment of the integrity that Adam had, in his haste and arrogance, overlooked. The entire process took less time than the other welders. Frustrated attempts, but it felt like a silent eternity. When Samuel finally lifted his helmet, the perfect, flawless weld glowed with a faint residual heat. He didn't look for praise or a round of applause. He simply moved on to the next task, his quiet dignity a powerful statement in itself. The knot of welders and foremen dispersed, but their conversations were different now. They spoke of the master, of how he did it, of the lesson they had just been given. Adam walked over to the completed weld, running his finger along the smooth, clean seam. He could feel the difference. This wasn't just a weld, it was a promise of strength, of safety, of a building that would stand for centuries. The shame he had felt moments ago was now replaced by a deep sense of respect and a quiet, firm determination to make things right. He knew that his most valuable lesson had been taught not in a boardroom, but on the 30th floor of a skyscraper by a man he had almost fired. This moment was not just a turning point for the construction site, it was a turning point for Adam Sterling himself. The day after the incident, a new energy crackled through the construction site. It was no longer a frantic, deadline-driven scramble, but a focused, respectful rhythm. The change was driven by the most unlikely of partnerships: Adam Sterling, the CEO, and Samuel the welder. Adam, now humbled and with a new appreciation for Samuel's skill, sought his counsel. He approached Samuel not as a boss, but as a student, asking for his input on a complex support beam design. This was the first of many such conversations, a new collaboration based on respect and a shared commitment to quality. The shift in the site's atmosphere was subtle but undeniable. The air, once thick with the low hum of anxiety, now carried a different kind of energy, a focused, almost collaborative hum. Adam Sterling, the man who had ruled by the sheer force of his will, was now a frequent presence on the 30th floor, but his demeanor had changed entirely. His sharp suits were often covered with a light layer of dust, his expensive shoes smudged with concrete, and his voice, once a booming command, was now a quiet inquiry. He sought out Samuel, not with a project report in hand, but with a blueprint. The first time he did it, the entire crew watched in a stunned, silent tableau. Adam, the man who had just a day ago threatened to fire Samuel for being slow, was now standing beside him, pointing at a complex junction of steel. "Samuel," Adam began, his voice hesitant at first, "the engineers, they've flagged this connection, the structural integrity. They're worried about the stress points once the cladding goes on. They want us to reinforce it, but I don't see a way to do it without compromising the aesthetic design." Samuel looked at the blueprint, then at the actual steel framework. He didn't speak. He simply studied the problem, his mind tracing the flow of force through the metal, seeing the building not as a diagram, but as a living entity under immense strain. He ran his calloused hand over the beam, feeling the cool, unyielding surface. After a long moment, he finally spoke. "The problem isn't the steel, sir. It's the approach. They're trying to add strength from the outside. You need to reinforce it from the inside." Adam's brow furrowed. "From the inside? How?" Samuel pointed to a small, unassuming detail on the blueprint, a minor cross-brace that the engineers had dismissed as an afterthought. "If you change the angle of this brace by just 3 degrees and weld it with a continuous bead, it will distribute the load more evenly. It won't be noticeable from the outside, but it will make this joint 3 times stronger." Adam was taken aback. The engineers, with all their advanced degrees and computer models, had been focused on a heavy-handed, expensive solution. Samuel, with his decades of hands-on experience, had found an elegant, simple, and far more effective one. It was a lesson in the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom. This was the beginning of their partnership. Adam began to bring Samuel more and more problems. The initial hesitation of the engineers gave way to a grudging respect, as Samuel's solutions proved to be not only correct, but brilliant. He found ways to improve joints, to reinforce weak points, and to streamline the welding process without sacrificing quality. He was a silent consultant, a master whose advice was now sought out before any critical decision was made. The crew, initially shocked, now watched with a growing sense of pride. They saw Samuel's quiet dignity being rewarded with the respect it deserved. The young welder Jake, who had mocked him, now hung back, watching Samuel's every move, trying to learn from the master. The work became more efficient, not because it was faster, but because it was better. The time saved from not having to redo faulty welds far outweighed Samuel's methodical pace. The building, once a source of stress and delays, was now being built with a meticulous care that felt like a labor of love. Adam, in turn, began to change. He started spending less time in his office and more time on site, not just observing, but learning. He learned the difference between a cold lap and a bead. He learned the precise sound of a perfect weld. He learned to appreciate the rhythm of the work, the quiet, focused dedication that went into building something that would last. He saw the integrity in Samuel's hands and realized it was the same integrity that his friend Elias had built into his designs. He had found the missing link, the bridge between an artist's vision and a builder's reality. The honor of working with. Adam paused, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "That moment shattered me," he said, his voice thick. I realized the man I had just tried to belittle was the very person Elias had spoken about for years, the man whose craftsmanship brought his most ambitious visions to life. I had spent 2 years trying to find him, and I had found him. Not in a resume, not in a corporate file, but on the job site, wearing a faded work jacket and holding a torch with hands steadier than most surgeons. He looked down for a moment, then back up at the audience. His name is Samuel, and everything that followed, the completion of the Atlas Tower, the transformation of Atlas Corporation, the new policies we now pride ourselves on, was built on the foundation of what he taught me. Not through speeches, not through corporate memos, but through the quiet, patient example of doing something right, even when no one's watching. A ripple of emotion moved through the crowd. Eyes glistened. Glasses were set down quietly on tables. Some executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, men and women who had perhaps once shared the same blind spots Adam had confessed to. "This award," Adam said, lifting the statuette, "is named after Elias Thorne, but tonight I dedicate it to Samuel, to the dignity of craftsmanship, to the wisdom of experience, and to the power of humility." The audience rose to their feet. The applause was thunderous, but it wasn't just for the man standing at the podium. It was for the unseen welder in a workshop in Queens. For every overlooked craftsman whose hands built the world but whose name was never carved into its skyline. As Adam stepped down from the stage, the award still in his hand, he felt no pride in the old sense of the word. He felt something deeper, a sense of peace, a sense of purpose. Later that week, Adam returned to the workshop. Samuel was where he always seemed to be, leaned over a table, guiding another young apprentice through the curve of a perfect weld. Adam didn't interrupt. He just watched. Samuel looked up after a moment and gave him a nod, no words needed. Adam smiled and nodded back, setting the Elias Thorne Award gently down on a nearby bench, between the blueprints and the steel shavings, where it truly belonged, the honor of working with. The man I was humiliating was a master, a legend, a man my friend, a Pritzker Prize winner, had revered. He was the most valuable person on that entire project, and I had been too blind to see it. Adam looked down at the statuette in his hand. I realized then that leadership isn't about giving orders. It's about listening. It's not about being the smartest person in the room. It's about recognizing the wisdom in the quietest voice. It's about respecting the hands that build your vision. Samuel, that welder, taught me that. He taught me the true meaning of integrity and craftsmanship. He taught me that a building's soul is in the foundation, not just in the penthouse suite. He looked out at the audience, his eyes shining. This award is named after Elias, a man who saw the beauty in every line. But the true spirit of this award, the real legacy of building, belongs to the quiet craftsmen, the masters who work with their hands, who put their heart and soul into every joint, every beam, every stone. It belongs to Samuel. The applause, when it came, was not the polite, customary kind. It was a standing ovation, a heartfelt roar of recognition and respect. It was an acknowledgement not just of Adam's success, but of his profound public transformation. Later that night, as the gala wound down, Adam stood by a window overlooking the city. The Atlas Tower rose against the night sky, its lights a silent beacon. He held the Elias Thorne Award, its polished surface reflecting the cityscape. He thought of Samuel, now retired, in his small workshop in Queens, passing on his skills to a new generation. He thought of the quiet strength, the unwavering dignity of that man. The honor he had just received was not about him. It was a tribute to the unlikely teacher who had saved his company, his legacy, and his soul. The Atlas Tower stood tall and strong, a testament to what is possible when power and humility, vision and craftsmanship come together not as adversaries, but as partners. It was the most beautiful building Adam had ever seen, and he knew, with a certainty that had been forged in fire and steel, that it was all because of a quiet craftsman and a small yellowed piece of paper.